Welcome to Putschcast. I'm your host, Oliver Heuter. This is a revolutionary podcast, as you know. And yes, we're trying video again. If you're listening to us on Spotify, Apple, or any of your other preferred podcast apps, why not check out what we look like in person? Or maybe you don't want to. I totally understand that too. You can hear that little giggle in the background. That's my co-host, Dave Sloan. Hi, Dave.
Oliver.
G'day.
Hello again.
Here we are, another Putschcast episode with you. And I just mentioned we are now on video. So welcome to the interrogation room, which is where we conduct this. And for everyone listening, you have to check us out on YouTube in order to see what it looks like. We have a topic today, and there's a few topics that we discuss when planning a schedule for this podcast where we think it's just too big for one episode, right? And I think today is one of those cases.
This is definitely one of those ones that probably way too much to digest in a single episode. So we'll start broad, and I think we'll probably decide on some offshoot episodes once we get to the end of it.
The good thing is we don't have to decide that. We don't have to make the decisions because we have an expert today with us, as we always do. His name is Robert Weis, and he is coming live to Putschcast from America. Here we go. Hello, Robert. Welcome to the interrogation room.
Thank you, guys. It's a joy to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
And at the center of today's interview is a very recent book you've published, and ironically it's got the same title as this episode, The Mexican Revolution. And you can find a link and some more about the book on the Putschcast.com website. But let's quickly talk about it, Robert. What made you write a book about the Mexican Revolution?
Well, I've always been interested in the Mexican Revolution. That's kind of been the center of my studies. Mexican Revolution is the event, the series of events that create largely what is modern Mexico, certainly Mexico for the 20th century. So it's both a reflection of events and ideas and beliefs and dynamics that had been brewing for a long time, and it's also going to set the course for Mexico of the 20th century.
I've never been to Mexico. I don't speak Spanish. I really don't know much about the country, let alone its history. So I'm very excited. Do you have a personal connection to it, or how did you make that your field of expertise?
I grew up in Northern California, a very beautiful area where there was also always lots of Mexican influence, it was an agricultural area, the wine country, so there's always lots of migrant workers and just presence of Mexico. And so I'd always been interested in Spanish and in Mexico. And when I went to live in Mexico in college, I was just stuck. I didn't know what aspect of Mexico I was going to study, but I knew that Mexico was going to be at the center of my life for all that I could imagine.
This revolution is really big. It's, we've already covered this. It's kind of complex. There are multiple phases. There's periods that you describe as probably civil war. So at the start of this, and at the start of it, I guess, is defined for the purpose of what we're talking about today is 1910. What does it feel like to be an average Mexican in Mexico? What are the forces that are at play? What does life feel like?
It depends, of course, who you are. We could think of Mexico in 1910, or let's say turn of the century more broadly. And we could think of three major groups. We could think of the oligarchy, that is centered around the dictatorship of Porfirio Díaz. We could think of then the masses, the people who live in the countryside mostly. And we have a small but significant middle class that is emerging at that time. And the middle class had been advocating for political change for a decade at least. But when the Mexican economy goes into decline around 1905, that is when there are more problems and more agitation.
Which direction are they leaning in terms of their interest?
They only emerged fairly recently. They were mostly like group would identify more closely as the lower strata of the oligarchy and didn't really see themselves as having perhaps distinct values or distinct um, goals, but they do start advocating very strongly for democratic changes, really in the early 20th century, and it's going to climax in 1910.
Yeah, okay. So democracy is an ideal at this stage, or an aspiration, apart from, I guess, amongst the oligarchy. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, especially for the middle class. The oligarchy, of course, could care less about democracy, and the masses had never really had much. They're living in villages. They have their own village government councils. Democracy over the 19th century had been important at different times, and a sense of nationalism. Certainly, it's not that they were apathetic to the political situation in their country, but democracy itself was always a rough and rocky process. And so when we see an uprising from the masses, it's not exactly democracy they're calling for.
So we're talking the first years of a brand new century. What you just described reminds me a bit of a catching up process with what happened in European countries about 30, 40, 50 years earlier. So was there a form of industrialization happening in Mexico? Or what's the economy like at the time? What do they make their money with, those oligarchs?
Well, that's the interesting part. The trajectory of the Mexican economy, I would say, from especially 1885, the mid 1880s, was certainly ascendant. It wasn't in terms of industrialization. It was more like other Latin American nations, led by the exportation of primary goods, so minerals and agricultural products. Um, which was more suited for oligarchical economy and kind of society in general, because obviously you have a lot of workers in mining and in agriculture that are getting paid very poorly, and we have a small group of landowners and oligarchs getting paid very handsomely. But I think that in general, there was a rise in the economy of most people in Mexico that is then going to take a sharp downturn around 1905.
Okay. So the economic success of Mexico is resulting in benefits that are not evenly distributed, and people are generally getting a little bit upset that they're missing
Yeah,
out.
And
yeah.
geographically, was Mexico in the borders that we know today? Because I know it's changed a few times in the 19th century, or was it the established state that we think of today?
Well, that's the interesting thing, because the state of Porfirio Díaz, which was the dictatorship that was eventually overthrown by the Mexican Revolution, had created the greatest degree of political stability that Mexico had seen since, I don't know, perhaps ever in its modern life. We have the invasion of the United States, and they take half of the country. The next decade, 15 years later, the French come and invade and rule the country in their own way for a few years, and so by then the borders are stable, more or less stable, and the state is also has developed a degree of stability that hadn't existed before.
Let's have that quick conversation, David. Can dictatorships be a good thing?
Short answer, yes. I think we've been seeing examples of where it's particularly beneficial. I'm going to turn to Robert on this one, but I suspect that in the earlier days of Diaz's rule, it was seen as a positive, and that there were definitely good outcomes for Mexico that resulted from his authoritarian ways. Toward the end, though, passing 1900 and into 1910, it obviously started to come a little bit unstuck.
How long was he in charge for, and how did he rule, Robert?
Well, the interesting part, well, I guess like a lot of dictators, he comes to power through force, but promising to promote greater democracy. And so he is a liberal, and he overthrows a previous generation of liberals because he says they weren't liberal enough, and they needed to be, uh, have alternating peoples in the presidency and in power, and that he was going to bring more democracy to Mexico. And then he arrives, and he convinces himself that he is the necessary person to hold Mexico together. But that's a fairly gradual process. He comes to power in 1876, and he really only becomes a dictator to the degree that he's changing the Constitution in order to extend and deepen his own authoritarianism, after around 1885. The moment when both Europe and the United States have huge demands for the products that Mexico can export. So minerals are generating vast amounts of money that Porfirio Díaz is using to create greater infrastructure, a network of trains, kind of dredging harbors so that they could have bigger ships, more trade to Europe and to the United States. And so precisely when he is turning towards authoritarianism in his political rule, he's getting vast amounts of revenue that's also adding greater stability to the country and to his own regime.
We learned that in a previous episode. Remember when we talked about South Korea? That's called a self-coup. So that's someone in charge who is meant to leave office, then decides he wants to stick around for a little longer, and then starts a self-coup and changes constitutions and then other rules and regulations, and then stays there for good. So he was there for a long period. He really shaped Mexico leading up to the revolution.
Yeah, he's there from with one small interregnum, but he's there basically from 1876 to 1910.
So in this period leading up to the revolution, the start of this appears to be almost, and this is from my fairly uneducated perspective, but almost a simultaneous uprising in different parts of the country for different reasons, but it's all happening at once. So what is it that actually kind of turns the tide, and is there a trigger, or is this something that's more of a slow boil?
The big call comes from the middle class, and led by Francisco Madero, who himself, he's middle class like we would love to be middle class ourselves. He's an extremely rich man, one of Mexico's richest families. So I wouldn't call him middle class himself, but he does give voice to a broad middle class, urban middle class, that is interested in having greater democracy, and now also themselves being able to enter into politics. He has other people joining him, especially from the masses from below. But the differences between these middle class values and objectives and the objectives and values of the lower class people in the countryside become evident pretty quickly.
Can you talk us through how Madero actually takes power, because it's a bumpy ride, and it's certainly not something that takes place in kind of a single phase. But he ends up there, and he ends up with the support of people like Zapata and Villa, at least temporarily. So how does that unfold?
Well, Porfirio Díaz announces that he, after 30 years in power, thinks it's time that Mexicans have reached a kind of level of maturity, that they are now able to choose their own leaders, and that he himself is 80 years old. And so he says, I think it's time, to have real free and fair elections. And then that is what is going to prompt Francisco Madero to say, like, hey, I've been thinking about this for a while. I've been traveling. I went to the United States. I've been to France, I've been to Europe, and I'm a very cultured man, and I have a really clear idea of the way forward. So I am going to, announce my campaign for the presidency.
Because these days, 80 is when you start running for president, right? So it's like, um,
I
so,
was thinking about that. We certainly have seen cases of old men who just want to hold on to
yeah.
power.
He's very progressive when it comes to that. So I think that's what you mean, isn't it, David? It's like, does he actually mean to retire, or was he forced into retirement or something like this?
My sense is that he wanted to hold on to power for at least a little bit more, but I think he meant that he wanted to choose his successor. Um, and if we think about who Porfirio Díaz was and where he came from, he crawled his way up from nothing. He is the son of a widow who is an indigenous woman. She was a washerwoman. So he grew up in poverty with a single mother, and he scales his way up through the military, and only through tremendous hard work and an amazing sense of sagacity and just knowing the decisions, what to make and how to play people off of each other. And then Madero comes along, who's really led a very comfortable life since he was born. And hadn't really done that much with his life. I think he was a visionary, but in terms of a man with lots of practical experience, certainly in governance, he had virtually none. So I think that Porfirio Díaz may have been personally adverse to, one, not being able to choose his own successor, but also having this kind of rich kid thinking that he could waltz into the situation after Diaz had created, in his mind at least, the modern Mexico.
Now that rich kid persona, how does Madero position that with the broader Mexican population against Diaz as sort of an oligarch? I mean, he ends up winning, but only just. What's the outcome?
Well, it's clear that Madero is attracting a lot of support, mostly from urban and people in towns, but across Mexico, people really rising up. And Madero's argument is that Mexico's institutions are great, Mexico's laws are great, and now we need to work them as they're supposed to be worked. And if we could have real democracy, starting with free and fair elections, that will be the central point that will at least allow Mexicans and the Mexicans in government to address many of the other social problems. And so Porfirio Díaz, that throws him in jail and says he can't run for president as someone who is in jail. And so Porfirio Díaz wins the elections, right? At that point, Madero walks out of prison and goes all the way to Texas and then calls for the armed revolt. And there's only after a few battles, Porfirio Díaz decides that he's had enough. He's in his 80s. He's going to take off. He's going to go live the rest of his life out in France. And it'll be, your problem. So Madero wins overwhelmingly in new elections, and then his real problems start.
That was some real important context, I think, to understand that it wasn't like we imagine it today. Everyone just goes to the battle pole, and if they get lucky, they win. So the years you just mentioned, so we are in 1910, 1911? Is that the year roughly?
1911 at this point, yeah.
So it's 3 years before the First World War. This is my European head on. Was it all peaceful at the time? Like looking at the neighbors of Mexico at the time, was there any pressure from the outside, or did all this happen in isolation pretty much in Mexico?
This is mostly happening in isolation. The United States, of course, has its fingers, at least is very aware of everything, and when it can, I don't know, we can't speak of the United States as a singular entity here, but certainly U.S. officials in Mexico are going to put their thumbs on the scale at key moments, but it is mostly an interior dynamic. And Madero is in power for, I think, 15 months before he is overthrown and murdered, and that would be the first and last free and fair elections in Mexico for the rest of the century.
And now we know why it's a topic for today. So there's our first political murder here on Putschcast. Question is, of course, who murdered him and why?
Well, there's plenty of bodies to follow from this. He will be murdered. The following two presidents will also be murdered. And then between them, there's plenty of blood. And when Porfirio Díaz says, okay, that's enough, they sit down and they have a treaty in Ciudad Juárez, and they create the Treaty of Juárez. And this is really and it basically says that we will have a peaceful transfer of power with a transition government for a little while, in which we will have many of the officials from Porfirio Díaz's government. They're still going to control much of Congress, much of the courts. And Madero is fine with this because, again, what he really wants is there to be democracy in the manifestation of free and fair elections. For the masses below that had risen up, though, they are deeply disappointed and furious about this, what they saw as a capitulation. Emiliano Zapata from the state of Morelos, especially, who had joined responded to Madero's call because in his communities they wanted more land. And so then that was always the central point for people like Emiliano Zapata, was the question of land. And the treaty did not address any needs about land. So he's furious, and always then deeply suspicious of Madero and his motivations.
Okay. Did Madero actually backtrack on any of his promises or commitments to Zapata, or what was there sort of expectations have obviously been poorly managed, but how did that come about?
Well, it's very difficult because they are, I think, in the end, incompatible. And so that's going to obviously rent their coalition, if we could even call it that. Madero promised the return of lands that had been illegally stolen from peasant villages. And so this emphasis on legality. The Zapatistas and other peasant communities weren't really worried about that legality part of it. And it's really hard to figure out what land was stolen, what was sold, where even my land ended, and the other land began. They wanted more land, and they felt like that they had a right to it because their communities relied on land. And there's also, significant strain of anarchist thinkers who are joining the Zapatistas, the followers of Emiliano Zapata, also who are saying land is a human right of anyone, and the poor people. The only way for poor people to solve their problems is to seize land themselves.
He's growing on me a bit, Madero. I have to say it.
He's an idealist.
We started off with a Nepo baby, basically. He's always had a good life and had this almost handed over to him. Then you gave us some context saying that actually he had to cross the border. There was some uprising happening there as well. And then the old man was basically pushed into retirement. However, he only stays in power for 15 months. And you just dropped the biggest name of the Mexican Revolution that I think for people outside of Americas, which we are, and many of our listeners, is the name Zapata that you've just mentioned. And that's the man you'll see on our cover today. If you are looking at this podcast, then you can see that face, and that is Emiliano Zapata is the man you can see right now on this image. Is there a keyword that I've come across called Ayala? Does that mean anything?
It's just the name of the town where Emiliano Zapata was when he launched his manifesto. And the manifesto is really important. It's called the Plan of Ayala. And they're all before you rise up in arms, you have to issue a written plan, and it's usually named after the place where you happen to be when you did that. So early on into Madero's presidency, Zapata I believe that Zapata really wanted to take advantage of the instability of the government, because this was the time when peasants could go and take land, and especially because there is this split in the elites between this kind of upper middle class and the oligarchies. That is the time for the peasants to strike. And so he rises up against the presidency of Francisco Madero. And then so we have the oligarchy is terrified that Madero is either going to ally with the riffraff basically of the country, or not be able to restrain the riffraff. And so they're terrified that people like Zapata, dark people, poor people, many of them speaking, Indian languages, that they are going to take over the country. And so the oligarchs then strike against Madero and overthrow him and murder him.
There is another character in here that we haven't mentioned yet. Was it Pancho Villa? Now, probably lesser known than Zapata, but can you tell us a little bit about him and his role?
Pancho Villa was one of the earliest to adhere to Madero's cause. He never renounces his cause. He sticks with Madero through thick and thin. He even fights against Zapata. They're later going to form an alliance. And so there's all these alliances that are breaking and reforming. It's very hard to make a very clear picture of it. But Pancho Villa is this figure from northern Mexico. We don't have these kind of millenarian Indian villages. The towns and villages are fairly new, 18th century, 19th century, centered around mining towns in northern Mexico. So he lives in Chihuahua, which is like the Texas of Mexico. It's the largest state, and it has lots of areas for cattle. I don't know, maybe like the outback, perhaps. It's not super peopled, but it is fairly wealthy, and there's lots of ranching, and it's closer to the United States, so there's lots of people who go coming back and work in the United States. And so Pancho Villa is going to attract kind of ranch workers and mining workers and railroad workers, and so this certainly the lower classes who are fighting for a better life, but in a way that's very different than Zapata, who is fighting for the vitality of indigenous communities in southern Mexico.
So I have to correct myself there. Let me get this right. Pancho Villa remained a supporter of Madero until Madero was assassinated. Yeah.
Yes. And following his assassination, he is going to be I would say the major force to fight against the forces of reaction that had overthrown and murdered.
And just one more time on Zapata, because he seems to be very iconic.
Yes.
But again, is he the archetype of a 20th century revolutionary when you think of the ones that followed later on in the 20th century? Is he like a template for, the Fidel Castros of this world?
There's a reason you see him on T-shirts.
Yeah, correct. He popped up on my Instagram feed the other day, probably because I was researching the Mexican Revolution. But you can now go on the web and buy a shirt with someone on it that lived 115 years ago.
Yeah.
And he's still relevant for somehow and to some people. Why is that?
I don't think that he is an archetype for future revolutionaries. He certainly is, maybe for like the Che Guevara, kind of great facial hair and like piercing dark eyes, a real kind of intensity to his look. It also helps that he's betrayed and murdered. And so he kind of has an air of martyrdom. But he's not a model for future revolutionaries because he is deeply distrustful of the state. And he doesn't want to form a state. He wants less state as possible. He would rather have just village governance. And so even when at one point when they're fighting against Huerta, who's the general who overthrows and murders Madero, Pancho Villa and Zapata have declared an alliance to fight against Huerta, and they go into Mexico City. and neither of them had been to Mexico City. It was a very strange and foreign place for them and their followers. And they even go into the presidential palace, and there's very famous photographs of this. But if you look at Pancho Villa, who loved being photographed and loved just sitting on his horse and having people, take pictures of him, and he's always got this great smile. Zapata always suspicious, always has a suspicious look, and he's very uncomfortable. He's sitting in the presidential throne. He wanted to burn the presidential throne.
Yeah.
He's like, what has the presidency, the office of the presidency, ever given us? We should get rid of it. So I think he is very much an idealist, almost a utopian, that later revolutionaries, I think, are going to be a little bit more, have a harder base, an ideological explanation of their actions.
Because all this takes place before the October Revolution in Russia, right? So this is, but after the first Russian Revolution in 1905, I think that's important to mention as well, which was also about land and bread and very similar goals. But is this where ideology comes in? Because we've just done an episode on the Paris Commune, 1870, 1871 is what we're talking about, where anarchy was a big thing. And anarchy not as in spray painting, graffiti, and knocking over bins, but anarchy as in an ideology of a non-government state. Was Zapata, was he a follower of that ideology of anarchy?
I don't think he had certainly urban intellectual advisors who are anarchists and are reading, and they have, glasses, and they drank espresso, but I don't think Zapata needed anyone to inform him about an ideology. Things were very clear for him. He needed for communities to be prosperous. They needed land, and if the only people who could have land are those who could pay for it, well, that doesn't sound very fair at all. So he there's a kind of natural anarchism in him, but he's not the kind of intellectual anarchist.
Not a Trotsky. So. He seems like a man of the people then. Was he very popular? Was he very popular and well known at the time? Because we've learned in some of our episodes here that from today's perspective, we think of those people as those huge figures. But back in the day, if you would have done a survey, most people wouldn't have recognized or known the person. So, but he had that charisma and PR work around him. De facto. Is that what happened?
Yeah, somehow, because he's a man who didn't give speeches. He's a man who didn't write. It's not clear if he was literate or not. So he's not a charismatic leader. He, in that sense, but although he certainly he was able to call upon legions of very, very loyal followers. But without being a kind of, puffed up figure. On the contrary, his kind of approach is to be quiet and understated.
This is pretty intriguing to me. So how did his ideology get communicated? Like, is this just word of mouth as whispers travel through the villages around Mexico? What's the mechanism?
Well, he has one document that he and his advisors wrote, and that's the Plan of Ayala.
Yeah.
And this document even takes on a kind of almost a religious figure as an article of faith. I'm sure that if you ask people who were fighting for the Plan of Ayala exactly what it says, I'm sure that I imagine that they'd be rather hard pressed to actually say what all the points were. But basically it was, we deserve land. And we're going to fight for land, and the revolution should be about land.
But a very simple message, and one that's really, really easy to connect.
Simple and consistent, just consistent.
I think I'm taking this away from today's message. Why was there a revolution in Mexico? People wanted land.
That absolutely. That is a central part of it, but it's always clashing with the statists, let's call them, who want to create a new type of state a non-oligarchic state, if you will, at least in its ideals. And so there's always going to be this clash. When revolutionaries get into power, they are not happy with peasants just taking land. They want there to be an orderly process that will go through the courts, etc. And so that's going to be a big clash.
Back to Pancho Villa, and if I've got this right, he actually invaded the United States at one point in this process. Is it Columbus, New Mexico?
It's Columbus, yes.
What happened there?
Well, whatever happened, it was a disaster. He was very upset. By this time, he and Zapata had broken with the ruling revolutionaries, and President Wilson recognizes the sovereignty of the ruling revolutionaries, and Pancho Villa was very upset by that. That's one explanation.
So who were the ruling revolutionaries
At that time?
Yeah. It's a lot of names. So
Did anyone know?
I apologize.
But
No,
people knew,
everyone knows.
did people know who was in power? Because sometimes you have situations where no one actually knows who's in power. It's just chaotic civil war. Because that's what we're in the midst of a civil war, right? Yeah. That's
So
what's
if I
happening.
take a step back
Yeah.
briefly, Madero was overthrown, murdered, and then we have this reactionary regime, a military dictatorship that brings all of the revolutionaries together. They overthrow this reactionary military regime, and then Carranza. Venustiano Carranza assumes the presidency. He is the head of what is the strongest faction, and the other faction is created by Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata. They're going to break up pretty soon as well. So we have Carranza in power, and Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata fighting against Carranza, and so Villa. He was upset with the U.S. government, but there are rumors that some gun dealer cheated him. So he goes into Columbus, New Mexico, invades a military base of all places. There's Frederick Katz, who's the one who's written the most about Pancho Villa, has the argument that what Villa wanted to do was to provoke an American invasion of Mexico, which would weaken the power of the governing Carranza.
America was smart enough to not register that invasion as an attack by a state rather than a rebel group that happened to cross the border and cause some trouble. It wasn't seen as a declaration of war by a sovereign nation at the time because of the chaos in Mexico.
Exactly.
Okay.
So if Villa was hoping to provoke this kind of nationalist uprising against the Americans and against the government that had allowed the Americans to invade, that certainly didn't happen.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that to us, Robert. So it wasn't the aggression of a state. The US were mature enough to understand that there is a lot of chaos in Mexico, and that it was basically a rebel group crossing the border, trying to cause trouble. What year was that roughly, just to get an idea of the timeline?
Yeah, that was March 1916 when Villa goes into a military base in Columbus, New Mexico. And perhaps people died, but it was probably the best thing that happened to Columbus, New Mexico, because that's, no offense, people from Columbus, New Mexico, that's all people know it. There's a museum there, and that's its claim to fame.
Oh, really? So it's still famous for that today?
Famous is perhaps overstating it a little bit, but yeah.
All right. So we just skipped a few years. So all-out civil war in Mexico. Can we just paint a picture of that? Because 1916, World War I was true and really happening. America wasn't involved yet. And it was a very modern mechanical war. We're talking trench warfare. We're talking barbed wire, gas, machine guns, aeroplanes. What was the Mexican Civil War like? Was it a bit more old-fashioned?
A bit more old-fashioned, but it also makes it very hard to explain, like to children or myself in this podcast, because most of the Mexican Revolution is internal fighting. It's a civil war, and so it's very hard to portray a very lineal process because it's like folding over itself and where coalitions are fighting against each other. It was, on the one hand, it was Villa is famous for, people in northern Mexico. They came from this long history of knowing how to ride a horse, knowing how to farm, and knowing how to shoot, and doing at least two of those things at the same time. And so Villa's forces were particularly strong in the cavalry. And the other revolutionary force that they're fighting against, led by Carranza, certainly has cavalry, but mostly is strong for its artillery, and especially is introducing the general of the Carranza faction is Álvaro Obregón, and he is particularly studying what's going on in Europe, and so he's building trenches, he's bringing machine guns, and he's bringing in a barbed wire, and those are, of course, going to decimate a cavalry.
Which also explains the high number of victims during the Mexican Civil War, because the numbers are quite shocking, right? You talk about in your book, I think, as well. So what are we talking about here? It's a 10-year period, so there's a lot of time to do a lot of damage. What was it like?
It's 1 million people who die. It's not a small number. But it's certainly, not fortunately as kind of mechanized and
but it's
modern
still,
warfare.
So you're saying 1 million people, that is horrendous for a civil war. That is, especially not a mechanized war. Like, this is still people on horseback.
Hand-to-hand, face-to-face sort of combat.
That is a very brutal massacre.
Yeah.
And so this goes on for another 4 years after that incident in USA.
Well, by then, everything is on the decline. The fighting is on the decline. By 1917, there's still some battles and there's still uprisings across the state. But the faction led by Venustiano Carranza and Álvaro Obregón effectively gets the upper hand over Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata. 1916, 1917 is when they finally sit down and start hammering out, for example, the new constitution.
And sorry, who's the one who got the upper hand? I didn't catch that name.
Yeah, it's Venustiano Carranza, who's the president of Mexico, and his main general, Álvaro Obregón.
Okay.
They will have their own problems, and Álvaro Obregón will lead an uprising that will kill Carranza. And Obregón
God, it never
himself
stops,
also...
does it? that is worse than the French Revolution, where everyone gets a go, but at the end they're all dead. Is that pretty much what's happening in Mexico?
Yeah, it's very close.
I think there's one piece in the chain that we're missing, just in the chronology of this. Huerta came to power after Maduro was assassinated.
That's the general, right? Huerta?
And he was kind of a military dictator, right? Now, how does power transition from Huerta to Carranza?
So he's overthrown, and Carranza assumes the presidency de facto. There's not an election, but he's the man who has, I would say, the broadest support and the broadest legitimacy for an interim presidency. And there's going to be elections in 1920. So he is the president from he's kind of a military leader the whole time, but he's an interim president from 1917 till 1920 when there are new elections.
Okay, that makes sense. All the dots are joined up. Now, you mentioned 1917 and the creation of the Constitution.
Yes.
I want to talk about that just a little bit, because it sounds like the Constitution was written in a very aspirational sense. It's not as if it came into practice as it was put down on paper, but sort of set the scene for how Mexico has developed since then.
So they sit down in the winter between 1916 and 1917, and they look at the previous constitution which was they all revered and they, but needed to change. The earlier constitution was very liberal in the sense that it favored free markets, it favored democracy, and it favored secularization. They were all in favor, in theory at least, with democracy and very in favor of secularization, anti-clericalism, which they enhanced, but they were very suspicious of the free market aspects, especially because land and also kind of exploitation of workers were massive grievances. They created mechanisms in the new constitution for the government to intervene in both to distribute land, to promote, specifically to promote social equality, and intervene in the economy to ensure the well-being of the working class.
You just touched on something that I haven't understood, and I'd love to understand it. With civil wars, there's usually, at least for at the start and for a while, there are clear lines there of what side you attach yourself to, right? Which one you pick the rifle and your horse up for, which side you fight on. I don't see that here at all. I don't understand. So the Spanish Civil War, fascists versus Republicans. Greek Civil War, communists versus conservatives. Yugoslav Civil War, ethnic lines, other wars along sectarian lines. What did people like? How did they decide which camp to fight on? And I assume the majority again didn't even want anything to do with it. They just wanted to live their lives. That's usually what civil wars are like. But you sort of pushed into a corner, and then because your brother is there, you end up in that camp. But what was it? Was it the only thing I'm taking away from now is country versus city? Is that the only division that was in that country? Because they're all Catholics, they all speak Spanish. Like, where was the division, and why 10 years of war?
Well, that's the question. That's the question, Oliver. And if you get that, then you might come, take my job. But it is very difficult. But it's not. So it certainly is rural versus urban, and there's lots of racial ideas and class ideas that track with the urban versus rural divide. But we could also think about it as regions. Mexico is a very regional country. It's divided by massive mountain ranges, which is one of the reasons why it has such cultural and linguistic variety. For example, some 60 different languages spoken in Mexico. And so I think people are choosing by their class interests, certainly, but also by their regional. So that's why, in the end, Villa and Zapata, even though they would get together and talk about how the rich people don't understand what Mexico's about, and they're kind of bonding over the poverty that they lived through, their agendas are also very different, just because the regions and the economies and the histories of their regions are very different.
It's just like you could all sit down and sort this out in a game of cards or something like that. Like,
I think it's too complicated for that. I agree with your point of view and the question that's being asked there, Oliver, but I guess my impression of this is that it's so multifocal and multifaceted that all sorts of things going on all the time. I'm a person who loves to try and summarize things and break it down to a single sentence, and I just can't do it with this one.
Yeah, especially when it turns into a civil war, then it gets very confusing. But we could still see kind of two revolutions at once. We have people who want to form, at least in theory, a more democratic, a more just state. And then we have this uprising from below, and who are very suspicious of the state. And they see that they already have their people, they already have their guns. They are going to take advantage of the disorderliness of the country to seize their moment. They're afraid that once a new state consolidates, then their opportunity to grab land for themselves and their communities, that will have passed. And the kind of state makers this is precisely the kind of disorderliness that's going to undermine their ability to make a more democratic state. And so they turn increasing authoritarianism and conduct a kind of scorched earth battles against these peasant warriors because they are destabilizing the entire country.
Global context, we started off early asking, and you said it's pretty much an internal conflict. But as World War I progresses and America enters the war, and we all might remember Americans were sort of laughed at the start of the war because they were pretty much cowboys from a European point of view. But then they even needed British helmets and stuff. They didn't even have steel helmets to begin with, and they were literally on cavalry, and they got a rude awakening on the Western Front. But is it true that Germany was trying to have influence on Mexico just to have that access to the American border from the south and open up another front? Was there talks during the Mexican Civil War that they could have become a party of World War I?
No, I think that is very much overstated.
Okay.
There is this famous Zimmerman telegraph promising that if Mexico, allows Germany to to invade the United States from Mexico, that Germany would return the states that the United States had taken in the War of 1847, 1848. No one in Mexico took that very seriously, and I think it's been largely overstated.
One of the things I put a circle around is in 1913, what's described as the 10 tragic days, which I think culminates in the assassination of Madero. I think there's an episode in that. What do you think? Like, what are the kind of pivotal moments that we can spend a bit of time on in maybe another episode to try and break this one down a bit further?
Well, I think a lot about moments, and I call them like if only moments. If only Porfirio Díaz hadn't clung to power and thrown Madero in jail. If only Zapata would have been perhaps more patient with and see if the government of Madero would have been able to deliver some of the goods in terms of land. I don't think that's possible, but we could look at moments when you just want to tell people, from this decision, there's going to be a lot of blood shed. And then so those are the moments when you want to tell them, no, turn left instead of right. Make a different decision. This won't benefit you and it won't benefit the nation. But that also allows us to dig deeper into what were the motivations and what did people see as possible events. Certainly the 10 tragic days, which culminate, as you said, in the overthrow and murder of Madero, is fundamental in that. And, lots of other features. We didn't even talk about Álvaro Obregón, who loses an arm in a battle with Pancho Villa, but manages to keep his arm. And then after he was murdered himself, his arm is placed in a kind of mausoleum monument to himself.
Now you've got me. Now there's an episode.
Good story.
Yeah.
So someone loses an arm, keeps an arm, loses an arm, and then it gets like a Lenin-style mausoleum that people can look at the arm.
Exactly.
This is fantastic. We shouldn't laugh. Many people died, but what I'm always interested in walking away with. So you sort of said before it died down in the end. Really, I assume there was a lot of fatigue. Obviously, after so many years of conflict, how did it in the end stabilize? How did Mexico end up in a post-Civil War state? Because again, World War I was over by 1920, but there was also the Spanish flu, and I assume that affected it as well because people just died on top of war. How did it calm down? Were people just too exhausted?
Well, you'd think, but it actually calmed down through more waves of violence. Every time there was an election, there was also an uprising among disgruntled revolutionaries who felt that they were being passed over unfairly. So they would rise up, and they would usually be lined up and killed. A kind of rash of executions. And so it is going to continue to be very bloody until the late 1920s. 1928, when Álvaro Obregón is murdered by a Catholic activist. that is when the revolutionaries who are managed to stay alive sit down and make the architecture of a new, stable, authoritarian state.
So we're back to square one. This is where we started before the Civil War. Seriously. That is exactly where we started, with a stable authoritarian regime,
but not
a few more
oligarchic.
people alive. Okay.
So what?
Wow.
What would you say are the? I mean, we talked about what it feels like to be an average Mexican living in Mexico in 1910 and how that kind of felt. Roll the clock forward to 1925. What's changed?
Yeah, because the new state in particular is focused on building itself into the undisputed central institution in Mexican society. And of course, they had to deal with the other major institution in Mexican society, which was the Catholic Church. And so in the 1920s, the government not only makes new laws, but starts to enforce these and old laws that are severely going to limit the power and the kind of scope of the Catholic Church, which is going to provoke yet another uprising. And then, the Great Depression comes, which is going to...
Yeah, of course, on top of that.
But by then people are absolutely exhausted, yes.
Yeah. Wow, I've learned a lot today. But I think the two names that will stick, because we're just getting started on this topic, is Pancho Villa, obviously, and Emiliano Zapata.
Yes.
Can we just find out what happened to them?
Yeah, they both end up murdered, of course. Pancho Villa first, he negotiates, when the wars are basically over, he negotiates his withdrawal from politics. He says, give me land in Chihuahua for me and my men and their families, and I will remain out of politics. And then he breaks that promise. Well, he didn't think he was breaking it, but he thought his promise had lasted long enough. Then in 1924, he starts to get a bit involved in politics, and he is swiftly murdered. Emiliano Zapata is betrayed and tricked and murdered in 1919.
Ooh, that's actually a really kind of complicated and interesting setup, that one. So that might be something we need to talk about separately as well.
I've come across one quote that I sort of want to use to finish off the episode almost, which is, I'm an outlaw, but the government are the real bandits. Apparently it's from Pancho Villa.
Good.
Wow.
It's a great one, and it reminded me of a protagonist we have here in Australia called Ned Kelly. And I think we'll do an episode on Ned Kelly one day, who was a bit before that time, but a young man who also rebelled against the colonial overlords in Victoria in the very south of Australia. And that could be a quote from him. That was the exact same story. However, we probably want to finish off by looking at it 110, 115 years later. How is the Mexican Revolution perceived today in Mexico? So when kids go to school, history lessons, how do they understand the Mexican Revolution? Is it celebrated? Is it commemorated? Is it forgotten? Is it not talked about? What's today's attitude?
It's celebrated. It's talked about. It is memorialized in street names, in the names of buildings, on days of the holidays. But to that degree, it's like people know that where Madero Avenue is, but they don't necessarily know who Madero was. So the day of the revolution, which commemorates the day of when Madero first called for openings, all the children get together and they do a parade, and the kids will dress up with big mustaches and bullet belts, and all of the girls will wear traditional Mexican clothes, and they'll have ribbons in their hair. And it's this day of festivity, but it's not really much of a connection with the actual revolution. There's the monument to the Mexican Revolution where lots of revolutionary leaders are buried, and they all hated each other.
Yeah.
And so that it's very hard to, and especially since the revolution eventually gives rise to an authoritarian state, there's a sense that this is absolutely our history and we're very proud of it. but any radical elements are purged.
Okay. I've learned a new word recently. It's called Disneyfied. So from what you just said, so the Mexican Revolution is Disneyfied a bit, is it? Among young people in particular?
Yeah, but without the fun. I mean, except for the
Okay.
parade, which is nice.
Yeah. But Robert, you've given me really good insight in especially the timeline, the complexity. It is so complex, and we need to come back to this topic. But for anyone who does want to dive a bit deeper, your book is a really good starting point, The Mexican Revolution. Robert will link the book on our website. Just go on putschcast.com. Dave, when I threw this topic at you, what did you know to begin with, and what do you know now?
Well, at the outset, I knew that there was a revolution.
Yeah.
Did I understand any of the complexity and the machinations? No. Definitely heard of the character Emiliano Zapata, as I think a lot of people have. Did I understand who he was, what he was about, and why he's sort of still famous today? Nope. I think I've developed a bit of a soft spot for Pancho Villa. He seems like my kind of a character, and I don't know why, but I've taken a bit of a shine to him, and I'm going to read a little bit more about him.
Yeah.
I do want to come back and get into kind of some of the more pivotal little periods of time and understand them in a bit more detail as a way of explaining all of the complexity around it. I think that's a good approach for us to take, and we'll recommend another episode, and hopefully Robert can join us for that.
Yeah. Robert, do you have a favorite protagonist from the Mexican Revolution?
I don't like any of them.
Okay, that's good.
I'm glad you're dedicating your professional life to this topic then.
You could have told me about
No,
something else.
I wouldn't say that. No. I have a very soft spot for Francisco Madero. I
Okay.
like Pancho Villa. Aspects of him are a little bit too much. Emiliano Zapata, the kind of the utopian fighter. Álvaro Obregón loses his arm and has the wherewithal to keep it. I don't know if people carried around like coolers just in case members were going to be lost and they wanted to keep them. But yeah.
So David, that was us today, Mexican Revolution. We had such a good expert with Robert on the call. You just said we have to come back, hey?
We absolutely do. This is an enthralling little piece of history, and I feel as though we've just scratched the surface.
Absolutely.
I've got more questions than I did at the start of the episode.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about it.
And I want to find out about that arm. Obviously, that's the
Where is it now?
that's the big shock moment. That's the one we need to put to get all the clickbait out there. So I want to thank you for listening. And if you've only listened and you want to see what this looks like when we are being interrogated by ourselves, we are now on YouTube. Just check out Putschcast on YouTube. Please help us beat the algorithm. We have pretty tough topics on our podcast, and I know it doesn't usually go viral because there's usually not a happy outcome. That's why I threw the word Disney in there, just to trick the algorithm a bit. But yeah, please share with your friends. Just forward a link to our podcast and leave a comment. That really makes a difference. It's an easy thing for you to do. And if you have any suggestions, any future topics, send us an email, putschcast@gmail.com, or visit our website at putschcast.com, and keep the revolution going.